Welcome to another episode of Infographic Instant. In this episode, we'll be looking at the question of whether governments grow to stabilize GDP, and looking more generally at the question about whether government responds in order to adapt to the organizational environment in which it functions. As a bit of background, before we discuss our infographic, we need to understand a little bit about why government might grow or shrink in response to the economy, if it changes at all to the economy. In order to make our discussion simpler, I've decided to break it into two major models. Under the first view of government, which we might call the Lewis model approach, government serves as a facilitator to help allocate resources from agriculture to industry, or from industry to services, or from services to new services. In other words, we expect to see the growth of government as resources change between sectors, because we have labor changing sectors, so they need unemployment assistance in the meantime. We might see capital changing sectors, so particularly for new sectors, government involvement is important where private incentives do not provide the price signals needed for investors to provide resources, and so forth. In our kind of slight misrepresentation of the Lewis model, simply as a heuristic to help understand how government might be involved in this process, we would expect to see government arising and taking more participation when there is money and resources in motion. Now, in contrast with the second view of government, which we might stylize as the Rosenstein-Rodan approach, government serves as a pusher for new industries, new sectors. And in this approach, you would expect to see government when a sector stagnant. So government grows very quickly in response to a relatively stable economy, but then we see government services wither away as the economy becomes more dynamic and as resources can allocate themselves more effectively. And by allocate themselves, I mean, of course, that the private sector can take investment decisions, employment decisions, and so forth. So in this view, we would expect to see low correlation between the size of government and changes in economic activity, because the government simply isn't needed after a certain stage of economic complexity. So with this background in mind, let's turn to the infographic and see what the first view of the data suggests. On the horizontal axis, we show the average change in GDP. On the y-axis, we show average change in government expenditure as a proxy for the size of government. Now, we see that across countries there appears to be a positive relationship between government expenditure and changes in GDP. So as GDP becomes more unstable, if you believe there's a causal relationship between these variables, then government responds by increasing expenditure. However, we see that the relationship between groups of countries is different. For the upper income jurisdictions, we see a relatively tight correlation between these two variables. For the medium income countries, we see a positive correlation, but with much more variation between countries. And for lower income countries, we see much less response, if any response at all, to government expenditure to changes in GDP. So this suggests to us that we have to take a differentiated view when deciding on the likely response of government to changes in GDP. And to foreshadow the conclusion from our main paper, and we provide the link below this infographic, we find that groups of countries and their governments take different approaches to changes in GDP. One theory does not fit all, and you have to know which country you're talking about before you can decide what is the relationship between these variables. This has been an Infographic Instant with Brian Michael.